I still have a jagged scar on my left thumb from the tempered glass. Not from baking, but from picking my life's work off the linoleum. My sister didn't just smash my bakery, she crushed it to make room for her peonies. I didn't scream. I just started planning. It was 4:15 inches the morning. The kind of dark that feels heavy, pressing against your eyelids before the streetlights even bother to flicker off. I was holding a lukewarm coffee in one hand, and my keys in the other. My boots hitting the wet pavement with a rhythmic, predictable thud. My lower back was already a dull, throbbing knot. It always was. That's the reality of baking they don't show in those soft-focus lifestyle magazines. It's not dusting flour over your nose and laughing. It's hauling 50-pound bags of winter wheat, burning the inside of your wrists on rack ovens, and smelling perpetually of yeast and stale sugar. But it was mine. I bought the lease for times the crumb times 3 years ago, gutting a defunct laundromat with my own bruised hands. I sanded the original hardwood until my joints ached. I installed the display cases. I pulled double shifts at a diner just to afford the imported Italian espresso machine sitting proudly on the front counter. When I turned the corner onto Elm Street, something was wrong. The air didn't smell right. Usually, by the time I hit the alley behind my shop, the faint, comforting aroma of the overnight proofing dough leaked through the exhaust, vents a sour, tangy warmth. Today, the air was sharp, medicinal. It smelled like crushed eucalyptus and wet, potting soil. I shoved the key into the back door. It didn't turn. It didn't have to. The door was already off the latch, swinging loose on its hinges. My stomach dropped. The coffee slipped from my fingers, the paper cup bursting against the concrete, splashing brown liquid across my ankles. I pushed the door open. The crunch was what I registered first. It sounded like walking on winter ice, but it wasn't ice. It was glass. I stepped into the prep kitchen, and my breath hitched in my throat, refusing to go down. The large, custom-cut tempered glass of my front pastry case was shattered. Millions of tiny, sparkling cubes littered the sanded hardwood floors I had bled over. But it wasn't just a break-in. A break-in is chaotic, desperate. This was methodical. My stainless steel prep tables had been dragged into the center of the room. The Hobart stand mixer, the one I took out a microloan to buy, was tipped on its side. The heavy paddle attachment dented against the floor. And the flour, oh God, the flour. 3 commercial bins had been dragged out and dumped. A thick, white paste was forming on the floor, where it mixed with spilled water. And then, I heard humming. A soft, off-key rendition of some indie pop song floating from the front of the shop. I walked through the ruined kitchen, my boots grinding glass and wet flour into a sickening paste. The smell of eucalyptus was overpowering now, fighting violently with the metallic tang of copper pipes and dust. Standing in the center of my storefront was my sister, Stella. She was wearing a pristine, cream-colored cashmere sweater and tailored linen trousers, looking like she had stepped out of an editorial shoot. In her hands was a bright yellow crowbar. Surrounding her were dozens of galvanized steel buckets, overflowing with peonies, ranunculus, and heavy, thick-stemmed lilies. She paused, her humming, turning to look at me. She didn't drop the crowbar. She didn't look caught. She looked mildly inconvenienced by my arrival. "Oh, good, you're up," Stella said, brushing a stray blonde curl from her forehead. "I was going to text you, but the Wi-Fi in here is absolute garbage. You really need to upgrade the router." I stared at her. My brain misfired, unable to bridge the gap between the sister I knew and the absolute devastation surrounding her. "Stella," I choked out, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. It was thin, papery. "What are you doing?" "I'm opening up the space," she said, gesturing vaguely with the crowbar toward the wall where my custom bread racks used to be. They were currently a pile of splintered wood in the corner. The aesthetic in here was so heavy, Nora. All that brown wood and the smell of grease. It was completely blocking the natural light. My hydrangeas need light. You smashed my pastry case," I whispered, stepping forward. The cold air from the broken window whipped against my face. "Well, it was bolted to the floor," she sighed, rolling her eyes as if I were the one being unreasonable. "And the contractors couldn't come until next week. I have a pop-up launch on Friday, Nora. The Botanical Society is coming. I couldn't wait around for you to slowly move your little baking project out." My little baking project. 3 years of 80-hour weeks. 3 years of missing birthdays, holidays, and sleeping. Get out, I said. My hands started to shake. A hot, prickly sensation crawled up the back of my neck. Get the hell out of my shop, Stella. Stella clicked her tongue, leaning the crowbar against a bucket of wilting roses. Actually, Nora, it's not your shop anymore. Dad transferred the master lease to me yesterday. We talked about it. You're 3 days late on your portion of the rent, and my floral business is ready to scale. He agreed this prime foot traffic is wasted on croissants. I froze. The building belonged to our parents, a retirement investment they bought a decade ago. I leased the ground floor from them. I paid market rate. I was late on the rent by exactly 72 hours because the refrigeration unit needed a new compressor, a fact I had clearly communicated to our father on Tuesday. You dumped my flour, I said, my eyes drifting to the kitchen. My chest was tight. A terrible, sinking realization hit me. I pushed past her, sprinting into the prep area toward the temperature-controlled fridge. I ripped the door open. The shelves were empty. I spun around. The large, heavy ceramic crock that usually sat on the bottom shelf was sitting in the deep industrial sink. Stella! I gasped, rushing to the sink. I looked down. The crock was empty. A milky, sour-smelling residue clung to the stainless steel drain. Oh, that gross, bubbling sludge! Stella called from the front room, her heels clicking on the floor. It smelled like vomit, Nora. I had to pour bleach down the drain to get rid of the stench. Honestly, you're lucky the health department didn't shut you down for keeping rotten liquid in a fridge. It wasn't sludge. It was a sourdough starter. I had cultivated it for 6 years. I named it Barnaby. It had survived a move across 3 states, 2 power outages, and countless feeding schedules. It was the absolute backbone of my entire bread menu. It was irreplaceable. I gripped the edge of the sink so hard my knuckles turned a bruised, mottled purple. The metal bit into my palms. I didn't cry. The grief was too dense, too heavy to be pushed out through tears. It sat in my stomach like a swallowed stone. You poured bleach on my starter, I said to the empty sink. You can just buy more dough at the store, Nora. Don't be dramatic. I turned slowly. Stella was arranging a bundle of pink peonies in a glass vase, completely unbothered by the fact that she had just executed my livelihood. She hummed again. I didn't yell. I didn't throw a punch, even though every muscle in my back was coiled tighter than a spring, begging for violence. I walked over to the dented espresso machine, unplugged it, and picked up the heavy, metal portafilter. I looked at Stella. I looked at the shattered glass. I'll be back, I said. My voice was completely flat, dead. Make sure you take your trash with you, she called out cheerily as I walked out the back door, the smell of eucalyptus burning my lungs. I sat on the edge of my bathtub for 3 hours. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't take off my boots. I just stared at the hexagonal tiles on the floor, listening to the drip of a faucet I hadn't had the money to fix. The phone call with my parents had gone exactly as I knew it would, deep down in the cynical, bruised part of my soul. Nora, sweetie, be reasonable, my mother had cooed through the receiver, her voice carrying the faint clinking of ice in a midday cocktail. Stella's botanicals are high-end. She has a contract for the mayor's daughter's wedding. You've been struggling with that bakery for years. Mom, I wasn't struggling. I was clearing a profit. I just bought a new compressor, I had argued, pressing the phone so hard against my ear it hurt. She destroyed $20,000 worth of equipment. She poured bleach into my starter. Well, you were technically month-to-month since January, my father chimed in from the speakerphone. And Stella needed the space immediately. We told her she could start renovating. If she got a little overzealous, we'll pay you back for the mixer. But frankly, Nora, it's just baked goods. You can bake anywhere. Stella needs the aesthetic of the brick walls. It's just baked goods. They didn't see the labor. They didn't see the art in laminating dough by hand, feeling the butter yield just right under the rolling pin. To them, Stella's flowers were art because they were pretty. My bread was just labor because it was meant to be consumed and forgotten. Stella was the golden child, the one who painted and threw garden parties. I was the dark cloud, the workhorse who smelled like grease and yeast. I hung up on them. Now, sitting in the dark, I felt the initial shock wearing off, replaced by something much colder. Anger is hot. It makes you sloppy. It makes you scream and throw things. What I felt wasn't hot. It was freezing. It was an absolute, sub-zero clarity. I finally stood up. My knees popped. I walked into my cramped living room, opened my laptop, and pulled up my files. If they wanted to play by the rules of business, fine. Let's look at the business. I opened the master lease agreement. My father was a cheap man. He never hired a lawyer to draft his commercial leases. He used templates he downloaded off the internet. When I signed the lease 3 years ago, I insisted on adding a few specific clauses to protect the heavy equipment I was bringing in. I scrolled past the payment terms, past the termination clauses. There it was, Section 12, Paragraph B. Tenant holds the sole rights and responsibilities to the customized ventilation, grease traps, and industrial water filtration systems installed at the tenant's expense. Upon termination of the lease, tenant reserves the right to extract said systems or sell them back to the landlord at market value. Disruption of these systems by any party other than the tenant without prior written consent constitutes a breach of structural integrity, rendering the premises uninhabitable for commercial zoning until rectified. I leaned back in my chair. A slow, dark smile crept onto my face, pulling at my chapped lips. Stella thought she was taking over a pretty brick box. She didn't understand the anatomy of a commercial building. She didn't know that the water she needed to keep hundreds of luxury stems alive every day ran directly through a localized, heavy-duty filtration system I had installed in the basement to purify the water for my bread. She didn't know that the HVAC system was heavily modified to pump out humidity, preventing the flour from clumping. And she definitely didn't know that by taking a crowbar to my prep kitchen, she had likely fractured the localized plumbing lines tied directly into that filtration system. She wanted the space. She wanted my building. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for Mitchell, an independent contractor and a regular at my bakery who loved my dark rye bread. "Mitchell," I said when he answered, "are you free this weekend?" "For you, Nora?" "Always." "Need a shelf hung?" "No," I said softly, looking at my bruised knuckles. "I need you to help me execute a completely legal extraction of my property, and I need you to cap some pipes in the basement where nobody can see them." "Sounds like heavy work. You moving out?" "I'm being evicted," I corrected him. "By my sister. She's turning it into a flower shop." Mitchell whistled low through his teeth. "A flower shop? In that old building? She knows the baseline humidity in those walls will rot delicate stems in a week if the HVAC isn't calibrated perfectly, right?" "No, Mitchell," I said, the coldness in my chest solidifying into a diamond-hard point of resolve. "She doesn't, and I have exactly 48 hours to remove my property before her big pop-up launch. Stella wanted my space for her flowers. I was going to give it to her, exactly as it was before I spent 3 years keeping the rot at bay. Let's see how long her beautiful, expensive peonies last when the building stops breathing for them." I closed the laptop. The smell of eucalyptus was gone, replaced by the scent of old wood and the metallic tang of revenge. The basement of the building had always belonged to the spiders and the damp. When I first took over the lease, the air down there was so thick you could practically chew it. I spent $6,000. I didn't have to install a commercial-grade dehumidification network and a reverse osmosis water filtration system. Bread requires precision. You can't bake a consistent crumb when the ambient humidity swings wildly, and you certainly can't feed a fragile sourdough culture with municipal water that smells like a swimming pool and leaves a chalky ring of calcium in the sink. Mitchell arrived at 11 p.m. on Wednesday. He backed his beat-up pickup truck down the alley, the brake lights casting long, red shadows over the wet pavement. He didn't ask questions when he saw my face. He just handed me a pair of heavy leather work gloves and pulled a wrench from his belt. We didn't go into the main shop. I couldn't look at the shattered glass again. We went straight down through the exterior cellar storm doors. The air in the basement hummed with the steady, reassuring vibration of my equipment. For 3 years, that sound was my heartbeat. "All right," Mitchell grunted, shining a heavy-duty flashlight onto the main water intake manifold. "If we bypass your filtration tanks, the lines feed straight back into the city's grid. The pressure is going to spike, and the water is going to come out hard. Really hard. Lots of iron. Lots of limestone residue." "Do it," I said. My voice sounded hollow, echoing off the concrete. I held the flashlight while Mitchell worked. The smell of copper, rust, and damp earth filled the cramped space. I watched his thick, calloused hands expertly loosen the heavy brass fittings. Water sputtered, hitting the dirt floor, smelling sharply of chlorine. Then came the HVAC. This was the heavy lifting. My dehumidifiers weren't little plastic boxes you plug into a wall. They were industrial steel units, bolted to the central ductwork, pulling gallons of moisture out of the air every hour. Uncoupling them felt like dismantling a bomb. We wrestled the heavy metal down from the ceiling brackets, my shoulders screaming in protest, the muscles in my forearms burning until they went numb. I stripped the mounting bolts. I ripped the silver insulation tape with my bare hands, the adhesive sticking to my skin like tar. We hauled the units up the concrete stairs one by one. I scraped my knuckles on the brick wall. I didn't care. I watched the blood bead up, bright red against the gray dust coating my hands, and felt absolutely nothing. By 4 a.m., the basement was quiet. The reassuring hum was gone. In its place was a heavy, stagnant silence. I paid Mitchell in cash. I watched him drive away, the bed of his truck loaded with my machines, the mechanical lungs and kidneys of my ruined bakery. I didn't sleep. I sat in my car parked down the street, drinking bitter, burnt gas station coffee, watching the sun drag itself over the rooftops. At 8 a.m., Stella arrived. She had a team of 3 assistants with her, carrying armfuls of expensive, imported blooms, blue delphiniums, white lisianthus, cascading orchids. They propped the front door open, laughing, their voices floating down the street. I rolled my window down just a fraction. Old brick buildings in this part of the city are basically sponges. They soak up the ground moisture and the humidity from the nearby river. Without my machines constantly pulling that moisture out, the air inside times the crumb times would rapidly turn into a swamp. And then there was the water. Florists need pristine pH-balanced water. Stella, in her infinite aesthetic wisdom, was currently filling dozens of clear glass vases with water straight from the uncalibrated basement pipes, unfiltered, unsoftened. I put my car in drive and drove home. I finally took off my boots. I slept for 14 hours, dreaming of glass crushing under my feet and the smell of bleach. When I woke up on Friday, the day of the launch, the weather app on my phone showed 92 degrees and 85% humidity. A brutal, early summer heat wave. I stood in the shower until the hot water ran out, letting the scalding spray hit the bruises on my shoulders. I dressed carefully. Black jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, my work boots, no makeup. I wasn't going to a party. I was going to deliver a legal document. My father had texted me 4 times, demanding I bring the final signed lease termination and the shop keys by 5 o'clock, so Stella could officially claim the insurance on the building for her business license. I printed the document. I put the heavy brass key in my pocket. It was time to go say goodbye. The first thing I noticed when I approached the storefront was the windows. They were completely fogged over. Condensation wept down the inside of the glass in thick, greasy streaks, pooling on the wooden display ledges, where my sourdough loaves used to sit in the morning sun. A small, hand-painted sign swinging above the door read, Stella's Botanicals, Grand Opening. I pushed the door open. The heat hit me like a physical blow. It was a dense, suffocating wall of moisture. It felt like walking into a poorly ventilated bathroom after a scalding shower. But it was the smell that made my stomach turn. It wasn't the sharp, clean scent of eucalyptus anymore. It was a sickly, sweet, swampy stench. When cut flowers sit in warm, unchlorenated, bacteria-heavy water, the stems rot, fast. The bacteria aggressively eat away at the cellular structure of the plant, turning the water into a cloudy, foul-smelling soup. It smells exactly like boiling cabbage and dirty dishwater. The shop was crowded. Well-dressed people, the local botanical society, friends of my parents, city council members were fanning themselves frantically with cardstock brochures. Their faces were flushed, shiny with sweat. Nobody was talking loudly. There was just a strained, uncomfortable murmur. I stepped fully into the room. My beautiful, sanded hardwood floors were slick with moisture and spilled water. But the flowers, it was a massacre. The hundreds of peonies, the centerpieces of Stella's entire launch, had collapsed. The excessive heat and humidity had forced them to blow open too fast. Their heavy pink petals were dropping in wet, sad clumps onto the tables. The tall, proud delphiniums were bent in half, their stems turned to a brown, slimy mush where they touched the water. And the vases. Oh, the vases were the best part. The hard, unfiltered city water had reacted with the glass and the organic matter. Every single clear, expensive vessel was coated in a milky, chalky film of calcium and rust. They looked filthy. In the center of the room, standing by the counter where my espresso machine used to be, was Stella. Her cream-colored silk blouse was sticking to her back. Her hair, usually perfectly curled, was plastered to her forehead in damp, frizzy strands. She was frantically trying to tape a drooping orchid to a bamboo stake, her hands shaking. My parents were standing off to the side, looking completely bewildered. My father was tugging at the collar of his polo shirt, his face red. "It's the AC!" Stella was practically sobbing to a woman in a wide-brimmed hat. "I don't understand. The contractor said the air was perfect on Tuesday. And the water. I think there's something wrong with the pipes. The water is brown." "Excuse me," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the sticky air like a knife. Stella's head snapped up. Her eyes went wide, then narrowed into a glare so hateful it could have peeled paint. She dropped the orchid and stormed toward me, her heels slipping slightly on the damp floor. "You did this," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "You broke the air conditioner. You saboteur. I have investors here, Nora. The mayor's wife is in the corner, smelling rotting stems. You ruined my launch." I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw exactly what she was. A child throwing a tantrum because the toy she stole was broken. "I didn't break anything, Stella," I said, my voice eerily calm. "I just removed what belonged to me." My father pushed through the small crowd that was beginning to stare. "Nora, what the hell is going on here? It's 95 degrees in this room. Where are the central vents?" I reached into my back pocket and pulled out the folded lease agreement. I handed it to him. Section 12. Paragraph B. "Dad," I said, watching his eyes dart over the paper. "Tenant retains all rights to customized ventilation and water filtration systems. I paid for them. They were my property. Since you terminated my lease and evicted me on 3 days' notice, I legally extracted my property." My father stopped reading. He looked up at me, his jaw slack. "You stripped the HVAC?" "I took the dehumidifiers and the reverse osmosis tanks. The building is operating exactly as it did when you bought it," I said flatly. "I told you I needed those machines to bake." Stella didn't think to ask what it takes to keep a building alive. "But my flowers!" Stella shrieked, gesturing wildly at a bucket of ranunculus that looked like they had been boiled. "You killed my inventory! This is thousands of dollars of product." I looked at the rotting flowers. Then I looked at the spot on the floor where she had dumped my flour. I looked toward the back kitchen, where the deep sink sat, holding the ghostly, bleached memory of Barnaby. A terrible, heavy silence fell between us. The anger I thought I would feel, the triumphant, spiteful joy wasn't there. I just felt incredibly, deeply exhausted. "You poured bleach on 6 years of my life, Stella," I said softly. The words hung in the muggy air. "You took a crowbar to my business because it didn't match your aesthetic. You wanted my space. You got it." I pulled the heavy brass key out of my pocket and dropped it onto a nearby table. It landed with a dull, final thud next to a puddle of murky water. "Have a great launch," I said. I turned around and walked out the door. When I hit the sidewalk, the 92-degree city air actually felt cool compared to the stifling rot inside. I started walking down Elm Street. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I had no bakery, no starter, and no job. I was starting from absolute zero, with bruised hands and an empty bank account. But as I walked, listening to the steady, predictable thud of my boots on the pavement, I realized my lower back didn't ache quite as much. I took a deep breath. The air smelled like exhaust fumes and hot asphalt. It wasn't yeast, and it wasn't sugar, but for the first time in 3 years, it felt like freedom. Sometimes, the sweetest revenge isn't screaming or throwing a punch. It's just letting people drown in the reality of their own entitlement. Stella wanted the aesthetic without the foundation, and she got exactly what she asked for. Have you ever had to walk away from everything just to prove a point? Let me know your most brutally justified moments down in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories where karma doesn't just knock, it completely floods the basement.